I want to read a number of verses together this morning from 1 Peter, from Ephesians, from Hebrews, and then from Matthew. If you want to follow along, you should see them on the screen. If you want to try to follow along in your Bible, good luck. Here we go. 1 Peter 4, this is what it says. The end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert, sober of mind, so that you may pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. Ephesians chapter 2. For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. This isn't from yourselves, it's a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Hebrews 12. Make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God. Matthew chapter 10, verse 8. You have received free of charge. Give free of charge. May God bless the reading of his word. The end of all things is near. So what should you do? If that's true, what would be the right response to that? Interesting. Peter says, first, pray. And again, he's not saying pray that the end won't come. He's saying pray and commune with God, so whenever that happens, you're with him. But then he says, love each other deeply. We should take the grace we've received, if indeed the end of all things is near, and serve. That's not really the message that you get in our culture. We kind of have a me-centered, me-focused, narcissistic culture. We all sit around taking pictures of ourselves and sending them to people. Paul said to Timothy that as the end approached, people would be lovers of themselves instead of lovers of God. He said that in those days, it will seem normal that people love themselves. This was in Rolling Stone a few years ago. There was an article about a woman named Robin Quivers. She was a co-host of the Howard Stern Show in New York City. After being diagnosed with cancer and going through 17 months of chemo, these were her reflections. This is what she said. What I've learned is really simple. Your life actually belongs to you. And it really doesn't matter what you do with it. But whatever it is, it should be what you want it to be, not what your mother or father or friends or society or anybody else wants. It should be I directed. And that's the only purpose we have for being here. Wow. That's really profound. Jesus actually says the opposite. Paul says that it's possible to live your life with meaning and purpose. It's possible to know God's will. But the only way that that would happen would not be by going out and finding it. It would be by submitting and surrendering to God. He says that we find our purpose when we accomplish God's purpose, when we believe not that we own our lives and that we're in charge of our lives, but that he is, and we use what he's given us to accomplish his purposes. That's when we find our own. So Peter says, he encourages believers to love one another deeply. And one of the ways that that happens in verse 10 is he says that that each of you have been given gifts, whatever those are. Those are spiritual gifts, those are resources. And he says, those have been given to you by God for what? What does he say? To serve others. And then he says, as faithful stewards of God's grace. I love that. You've been given grace. And he says, now you become a steward of grace. What does a steward do? A steward takes a gift and he shares it. That's what stewardship is. And we get to share God's grace. Think about that. Grace is not an idea that exists anywhere that I know of outside of Jesus Christ. There are no other religions that preach grace. They preach law, they preach religion, but grace, that the God of the universe has extended grace. And he says, you've received from his hand gifts, graces from God. Serve each other. The ancient Greeks, they used this word grace, charis, to mean unmerited favor. So it's something that a person who's stronger than you, somebody who's helping somebody who's weak or needy or dependent, the weak person can't do it on their own, and so the stronger person extends grace. That's what God does. God's choice to love and forgive and embrace and accept and help us when we have done nothing to earn it, that's what grace looks like. The writer to the Hebrews says, make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God. Here's the picture. God is the owner. Grace comes from him. We receive it freely, and he gives it to us so that we can not only know his joy, but so that we can use what he's given us to serve others. So let's walk through this. Here's the first idea. All of us need grace. You good with that? We forget really quickly how badly we need it. And we forget because you live in a corrupt world long enough, you start to think it's normal. So you look around and you see poverty and violence and abuse and injustice and apathy, and you just kind of get used to it because actually it's in all of us. But God never gets used to it. God never likes injustice. God never is okay with corruption and poverty and violence. Grace doesn't overlook it. God's standard is the shalom of God, the sinless purity of his nature. He's not severe, he's not unreasonable, but he knows that the only condition that you and I can survive and thrive in is when justice and love and the shalom of God flourish. So, that's not the world that we live in. So how can we attain it? By grace. It's a gift. So, we forget how badly we need it. Let me just remind you this morning. I'm just going to read a list of a couple things. Listen to the list and see if there's anything on there that you might relate to. Characteristics that you might have seen passing through your life at one time or another. Here they are. Prideful, judgmental, cold-hearted, apathetic towards the poor, greedy, envious, lustful, unfaithful, deceitful, promise breaker, secretly cruel to other people, cowardly, stubborn, self-centered, careless, joylessness, complaining, loveless. If you didn't find yourself in any of those, I can keep going. It's in all of us. It's broken. Grace is not tolerance. Grace does not say, it's okay. It's not okay. It's an offense to God. But he's willing to pay for it, and to forgive it. That's grace. And we all need it profoundly. There's a guy who did this research on the English language. What are the 3 most commonly spoken phrases in the English language? First one, no surprise, or not that's most often spoken, that people most often want to hear. What are the things in the English language that people want to hear more than anything else? First phrase, I love you. Second phrase, I forgive you. Third phrase, it's time for dinner. Wait a minute. Why? It's not just about the food. It's about the desire to be with people. That's the gospel. God says in Jesus, I love you, and I forgive you, and I'd like you to come to my house for dinner. That's the gospel. But the only way you can have it is by grace. And we need it so desperately. So here's the picture. A few years ago, we were living in Abidjan, which is the capital of Côte d'Ivoire. It's right on the Atlantic Ocean in West Africa. Got up one morning to some really tragic news. The night before, an airplane was taken off heading to East Africa, and it got a little bit out over the ocean, and then it went down. Didn't crash. It seems like it just couldn't get up high enough, and it went down in the water. Not many people were killed by the initial impact, but most of them couldn't swim the 5 kilometers back to the shore. Maybe 3, maybe 4 made it. One of the guys, a French gentleman, he tells the story. He was reading the newspaper, and all of a sudden they were underwater. When he came up, it was dark, but he could see the lights of the city in the distance, and he just swam 5 kilometers. Just as the sun was coming up, he got up on the shore. His wife gets up that morning, turns on the news, hears the news that the plane that her husband had left on the night before had crashed. He got out, got in a taxi. A few minutes later, he walks in the front door. Most people didn't make it. 5 kilometers is a long, long swim. I often would stand on the beach in Abidjan and I'd think, you know what? If I jumped in the ocean here, I could actually swim to New York. I mean, I couldn't actually do it, but it's possible. Like you could jump into water. But in truth, nobody can swim that far. It's not possible. It's a guy by the name of Benoit Lecomte, a French gentleman, who decided to swim from the United States to Europe, 3,716 miles. He did it, but only 8 hours at a time. Every night somebody would come, take him out of the water, give him a meal, let him sleep, and then he'd go do it again. You can't swim that far. It's not possible. Well, what if to know and be with God, what you have to do is be perfect? Nobody can do that. Doesn't matter how good you try to be, you can't do it. So God comes and he pays the debt and he extends grace. He throws out a lifeline and he brings us into the boat. That's grace. That's what it looks like. Here's the problem. We receive grace, and then something happens, and we begin to forget that the people who haven't found grace yet, they need it too. We think, well, yeah, but I did swim pretty far. So what? If you swim 10 miles or 30, you're still going to drown. Without grace, you won't make it. If you're here, it's by grace. So you can't look at anybody else who's drowning and go, what is wrong with them? They need grace. That's what's wrong. Second idea, the nature of grace. Jesus preaches this message of the kingdom, and then he says to his friends, I want you to go preach this message, heal the sick, pray for the sick, give to the poor, preach the message. And then he says this, end of verse 8, you have received free of charge, give free of charge. Grace always gives. When you hold on to grace, it's no longer grace. It becomes something else. You cannot possess grace. This doesn't belong to you. You can't have it. You can receive it and you can give it away, but you can't put it on your dresser and keep it for yourself. It will no longer be grace. I'm sure you've heard this picture in Israel, the Dead Sea. Never been there, but they say that the water is so dense or so salty or whatever that you can almost sit on it. I've never tried it. I'm just going by what they say. The water's dead. Here's the thing. There's actually fresh water that comes into the Dead Sea, but it comes in and it dies because there's nowhere for it to go out. That's what grace does. It's a gift that's given to us. And he says to his friends, freely you've received, give it away. But when you don't, it dies. When you do, it's just beautiful. So how do I explain this? Well, I thought the best way to do it is a story. Because grace is so amazing when you see it, it's better told in a story. Came across this story this week. You may have heard the name Dr. Francis Collins. Who is he? He holds a PhD, an MD, and a bunch of other Ds. He's just a brilliant, brilliant man. He was the head of the Human Genome Project that deciphered all 3 billion letters of the human genetic code. Unbelievable guy. I heard him talk once. I understood about 2 words. Just this brilliant man. He's also somebody who confesses to be a committed follower of Jesus Christ. Not all scientists are like that. So he has taken a lot of flack, not because of his intelligence, but because of his faith. Over the years, on a couple of occasions, he's taken opportunity to very graciously have a debate, a conversation with atheists like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and others. In spite of his brilliance, he's often been maligned simply because of his faith. He was nominated to lead the National Institute of Health. Don't think that ever happened because of the guff that he got from his colleagues. Not because of his character, but because he was a follower of Jesus. They said terrible things about him. What was his response? Well, every time he goes to England to teach at Oxford, he calls his friend Richard Dawkins and he takes him out to tea. You know the name Hitchens. Hitchens wrote the book, God is Not Great. Just an avowed atheist, very vocal one. A number of years ago, he was found to have esophageal cancer. One of the first people that visited him was Dr. Collins. In his position, he had the possibility of knowing all the different tests that they were doing, the different treatments for cancer. And so he spent a number of weeks with Christopher Hitchens and his family, helping them to find a treatment, hoping that he could get through this cancer. Interesting. Hitchens was someone who was very vocal about his atheism. During the 1.5 years that he lived, walking through cancer, he recounted, he journaled it in Vanity Fair. He had a column every month talking about the journey. And in one of the columns, he talked about some of the emails that he had gotten from Christians. Some of them really nasty. I rejoice that you got cancer. Maybe now you'll stop talking bad about God. One celebration, maybe the end is near and you'll get what you finally deserve in hell. So he wrote about it. what's beautiful is one of the last things he wrote was about his friend, Dr. Collins. He said, in tribute, Dr. Collins is one of the greatest living Americans I know. On his deathbed, there was no great conversion, but from one friend, he experienced the grace of God. That's what it looks like. Some of you maybe have read the book Blue Like Jazz. Donald Miller first became a Christ follower. He was in college when he really grabbed onto his faith. He was out in Oregon at a fairly secular school. In fact, Christians were regularly mocked. But he was there with a couple of friends that were Christians, and they wanted to share the grace of God. And so they're trying, how can we do this? So this is what they did. Genius. At one of the college fairs, they opened a booth. It was a confession booth, but it wasn't a confession booth for you to come and confess. It was for you to come and have somebody confess to you. So these students would come in and sit down, and Donald Miller and his friends would be sitting there, and they would talk about some of the sad things that the church has done through history, and they would just say, well, that just doesn't honor Jesus. Would you forgive us? And this is the one I love. Donald Miller talks about a guy who comes in, sits down, and Donald Miller says, I just need to confess. I'm a follower of Jesus, but a lot of times I don't honor his name very well. He said, Jesus says to heal the sick and feed the poor, and honestly, I haven't done a lot of that. And Jesus says to love those who persecute me, but in truth, I often lash out, and especially when I feel threatened. And you know what? Jesus did not mix spirituality and politics, and I grew up doing that all the time. So I just haven't represented Jesus very well. Would you just forgive me? You know what the response was? The guy broke down and wept. People need grace. You need grace. I need grace. And the nature of grace is that when we receive it, it begins to flow back out of us. How does that happen? Well, here's the last idea. Grace is not about doing graceful things every once in a while. It's actually about rewriting the whole narrative that you live out of and beginning to live out of God's grace. Like that becomes the major note in the song. What would it look like if that happened? It'd be beautiful. It's just at the Global Leadership Summit that Bill Hybels puts on every year. And he is the one that does the opening speech every year. So this year, he talked about, this is business leaders and church leaders. I think there's like 400,000 people at this conference all over the world. This is what he said. One of the biggest challenges facing leaders around the world today in this generation is how do you lead in an era of incivility? We live in a really incivil time. It's on every hand disrespect, divisiveness. So Hybels is challenging leaders to create cultures of respect where grace is a part of the culture. He talked about a book. It was written by a woman named Christine Porath. It's called Mastering Civility. She's writing to businesses. She's not writing to churches. She's writing to business leaders, and she's challenging them to civility. This is some of her findings. 1998, she said that 25% of people in the workplace were treated rudely at least once a week where they work. By 2011, that number rose to 50%. By 2015, way beyond that. She's not writing about this because she's concerned about the grace of God. She's writing about it because she wants businesses to make money. And businesses where people get treated like that, they lose money. In fact, her findings say that when people are disrespected, their productivity drops by 50%. People want grace. But we live in a culture where that's not very evident anymore. When this guy owns like 5 or 6 restaurants in New York City, and he has a code of respect. We will respect everybody. You know what? That's what it says in 1 Peter 2:17. Show respect to everybody. Well, this guy says, if you work here, that's what it will look like. And this is his comment. Customers can taste incivility in their food. So when you don't love each other, their food tastes bad. When we don't love each other, the gospel doesn't look very good. Refuse to use incendiary, belittling words. Jesus said, don't even call somebody a fool. Why? Because that's an incendiary word. You call somebody a fool, what are they going to do? They're not going to thank you. They're going to say, you're a bigger fool. And then you have to say, well, you're the biggest fool. And then he has to say, your mother's a fool. And then it just goes totally off the track. That's what incendiary words do. So Jesus says, don't talk like that. Words matter. Hear me. Grace is more than words. But it's often in our words that grace is either absent or present. They matter. So, we're faced every day with the choice in our words of judgment or of grace. I was looking for a good example to bring this home that's practical. What does this look like when it's lived out? Well, this happened just this week. My daughter is a student at Wheaton College just outside of Chicago. And if you know anything about Wheaton, it's been there for a long time. It's a Christian college. Often they're speaking in the evangelical world. Billy Graham comes from there. It just has this long history. Well, this is what happened this week. Apparently, last March, there was a new kid, joined the football program, came to Wheaton, and a number of the other guys on the football team took him and another guy, taped him up, put him in a car, dropped him off on some baseball field somewhere, and the word they use is hazed. They were hazed. That happened back in March. It was reported. The school administration did an internal, sorry, it's coming to me in French. That's exactly what I was thinking. An internal investigation, they had an external investigation, and also a police investigation. And at the end of it, all three of them came to the conclusion that while what happened was not good, there was no criminal charges. So the school punished the guys that were involved. End of story. Now, months later, the young boy that was the victim in this, or one of them, left the school. Now he's pressing charges and telling his story. It actually broke at 5:30 on Monday evening in the paper in Cleveland. So this just blew up. And within a couple hours, there's helicopters, it's all over the news, and everybody has their opinion of what happened and why it happened and who should be punished. Ellen and I are on this parents' Facebook page. And as each day progressed, it just got crazier and crazier. Like everybody it just wasn't pretty. In the middle of that, one of the professors wrote this, and I think it's really, really helpful. He calls it, Choose Your Scapegoat, a Wheaton Pop Quiz. And this is what he says. It's another year, and a devastating, agonizing situation has happened at Wheaton College. As news unfolds, a choice of scapegoats present itself to which varieties of people will irresistibly be attracted. Make no mistake, we are sad and sickened by whatever it is that happened. It's not right. But some have asked, what do we tell students while we wait for the verdict? Well, I decided to give a pop quiz, the hardest one I'll ever give. Cruel, I know. But he says, as a word of note, if you don't share my Christian faith, I don't expect you to try this quiz, but it may give you a perspective on the Christian approach. If you do share my Christian faith, but you don't like my method, I'm fine with that, but I'm not trying to be cute. Finally, I will guarantee that anyone that takes the quiz, Christian or not, will fail. Here's the quiz. So what do you do in the face of this? Question number 1. He says the first thing you need to do is you need to choose a scapegoat. Somebody's wrong here and somebody needs to pay. Well, what are the scapegoats? Well, here they are, he says. You could choose scapegoat A, the boy that was a victim of the hazing. To some extent, he's already suffered, and there's a temptation now to cause him to suffer again and suggest that this was all a fabrication. Scapegoat B. It's the victim's parents and their lawyers. And the speculation is running that suggests that maybe the victim is just a stooge and his parents and the lawyer are looking to make money in a lawsuit. Scapegoat C, the journalist. It's their fault. It was their desire to generate a story, so they just took one side of it, they ran with it, they hit the clickbait jackpot and made the lives of students and staff and faculty miserable. Scapegoat D. Well, the fault is the football team and their coach. The whole culture of football generates this terrible thing, and the students that are part of it are the real culprits, and they need to pay. Scapegoat E. It's the administration. If they would have taken care of this and punished it right, we wouldn't be in this place, and there must be some misguided, unseen purpose that they have that permitted all this. Last scapegoat. Maybe the fault is really the whole thing of American evangelicalism, the political triumphalism, the muscular Christianity, the whole thing. That's what made this happen. So he says, question number 1 is choose your scapegoat. And you know what? We're all really good at this. When I heard this news on Monday night, when you hear stuff like this, your first response is emotional. And it usually doesn't have anything to do with what happened. It has to do with you. I responded because my son played football at Wheaton College. So when I heard this, something stirred in me, and I wanted somebody to pay for the wrong that had been done. So I chose my scapegoat. I'm not telling you who it is. It's none of your business. But I chose one. That's what we do. Somebody needs to be sacrificed. Somebody needs to pay for what happened. So he says the second question on the pop quiz is, now that you have your scapegoat, imagine that person or those persons getting the judgment that they deserve, the incrimination that they're due. So just start to imagine it in your head. If you chose the parents or the student, just imagine them having a headline in New York Times showing that they made up this whole fabricated story to get back at the football team. And then they have to show up on Good Morning America and apologize to Wheaton College for... Just imagine. Or maybe if you thought it was the football team, imagine the whole program being shut down forever and the funds being redirected to add an addition to the library. Or maybe you chose the administrators. Just fantasize in your head that they all get fired and get what they deserve, and a new group of really capable people comes to lead this thing right. Or maybe if it was American evangelicalism, you can just imagine its expiration after being exposed as fraudulent to the core. Imagine all the emptied churches, and who would do that? Probably everybody in this room. choose a scapegoat, and our first response is emotional. Before, when that happened, you'd usually take time and you'd kind of swallow that and think about it, and maybe by God's grace, a little grace would get mixed into the flavor, and that doesn't happen anymore. As soon as you feel something, it's on the internet. And then it just gets uglier and uglier and uglier. So, here's the third step in the quiz. Now you got to choose. What are you going to do? You going to exact judgment, or are you going to extend grace? Here's the big reveal. Christianity teaches that none of these fantasies, none of these vengeance plots, delicious as they may seem, would actually satisfy us. Imagine if the young boy is found to be a fraud. All the damage is already done, and he's still the beloved of God. Imagine that the whole football team is shut down and the money put into a library. It might solve one problem today, but 4 more would be created tomorrow. And on it goes. So if what we really want is judgment, if that happens, we still won't be satisfied. And God offers a whole different solution. So here's his conclusion. Your grade? Sorry, you all failed. No one can really make it through this honestly. Grace is not the language that we speak. Here's the makeup quiz if you want to get your grade up. If you're up for it, the hardest mental exercise, a prayer exercise really, is to take the victim to which you are most inclined, and instead of imagining them being sacrificed, imagine mercy being poured out on them. That's what Jesus said we're supposed to do. When in our soul, we've chosen a scapegoat and we want judgment, he asks us to bless them, to forgive them. And when we do, it changes us. Imagine whoever it is in this picture that's wrong, if you choose to pray grace and pray mercy when it's actually found out who the perpetrator is, this professor says, you'll be standing there ready to extend mercy, which is undeserved. And the word for favor that is completely undeserved is the word grace. What if God wants mercy more than he wants sacrifice? He longs for grace. Let me close with this idea. Grace is not tolerance. Grace is not saying, you know what, everything's okay. It's not. In this story, a wrong was done. Grace is, regardless of what that is, longing and extending grace to everyone in the story. Grace admits that we're wrong, that we're broken. We look for a scapegoat, and that's the good news of the gospel. I think there's a picture of a scapegoat. The image in the scriptures of a scapegoat is in the Old Testament when they came to worship God and they had to confess and ask for forgiveness. They would put their hands on the head of a goat or a sheep and in so doing impute the wrong that they had done onto the animal. And the animal was taken out and killed to bear their sin. And that's the gospel. There is a scapegoat, and his name is Jesus. And he's paid for everything. And he's given us that by grace. And so when you have that by grace, the only thing that makes sense is to be graceful. Because other people deserve it? No. Because that's who God is. May he make us people like that. Invite the team to come. Let me pray, and we'll just use this song to close in prayer. Father, sometimes we think about grace and we treat it lightly. We only have it because you paid for it with your life. I just pray this morning, Lord Jesus, that you would pour out anew your mercy. Not because we deserve it, but because we need it. And that you would make us people of grace, that treat the people where we work, the house that we live in, with grace. That we love each other here with grace. Not for our glory, but for yours. In Jesus' name, amen.